Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with reference recordings. And today, oh boy, we're talking about a biggie, the Berlioz Requiem. Now, everybody knows what the reference recording has to be, don't we? It's Charles Munch. Before Charles Munch recorded the thing for RCA in 1960 in glorious living stereo, whatever they called it, there really was no Berlioz Requiem. Yes, people like Hermann Scherchen and Thomas Beecham and people like that, did it. But boy, what a difference to have fabulous sound and a fabulous orchestra and an amazing Berliozian. But there's a complication. Now, in this series of reference recordings, we have had many discussions, some of them intelligent, some of them markedly less so, about the fact that the selection that I may have picked may have had less availability in Europe than in the United States, or vice versa, if it was on an American label like RCA or Sony, because back in the day, in the 50s and 60s, those labels didn't have the same international distribution that we are used to today and which we've come to expect. And when you deal with like streaming things, everything's available everywhere, so it doesn't make any difference. But in those days, there were licensing arrangements between the two, like Decca and RCA had a deal, things like that. And so things could show up on various labels as though they were productions of that label, though they'd actually been licensed and whatnot. I mean, it was much more complicated than it is today. 99.9% of the time, I would say, I'm right, and the people who talk about, well, in Europe it was this way, are full of crap, because I actually know what was going on in Europe at that time, for the most part. And, what can I say? That's just, the way it is, and you can either accept it or not. But I'm not saying that to be defensive. I'm saying that because here there is a genuine split between Europe and the United States, which is very interesting. And I've pointed out some of those also along the way, where it was really, there was really a division. And the Berlioz Requiem is one of those cases, because Charles Munch and the Boston Symphony were the recording. They came out in 1960. The référence, absolutely, hands down. However, Munch re-recorded this thing for Deutsche Grammophon 8 years later, in 1968, the year he died, with the Bavarian Radio Symphony under Peter Schreier. And I happen to know that if you were hovering about Europe or in that part of the universe, that was the Munch recording that you probably heard and probably got, because it was just totally more widely available than this one was at that time. And I remember very, very vividly having a discussion. Oh, this, by the way, is infinitely superior as a performance, not necessarily for the choral singing, because the Bavarian radio chorus is very, very good, and the New England Conservatory chorus is young and enthusiastic and fresh-toned, and some people find them a little bit ragged, but I don't. I mean, I think they sound just great. And the tenor is Peter Schreier in the Deutsche Grammophon recording. And here it is Leopold Simoneau, who's marvelous. Make your choice. It's, the tenor part's rather brief anyway. It's the Sanctus. But, anyway, the bottom line is I was having a conversation with my good buddy, Christoph Huss, music critic currently at Le Devoir in Montreal, but then he was the editor of Répertoire magazine, and he was also a choral singer who sang, with the Orchestra de Paris and whatnot, and was, knew all these conductors quite well. Not Munch necessarily, but he was a Munchian, because Christoph was from Strasbourg, from Alsace, and so was Charles Munch, and he knew his Munch. He really knew his Munch. But what happened was, this version on RCA was spottily available before CDs came out. I mean, it was out on LP, and then, like most of these recordings, they all disappeared. And then as the CD era bloomed, these things started to get reissued. This was the living stereo SACD super duper uber remastering, but it was out on CD a little bit before then. However, for a great span of time, you couldn't get the Munch Berlioz Requiem, the Boston one, on RCA. And the DG one, I don't know how long that stayed in print, but that was the one that was over there and the one that everybody heard. So I was speaking to Christoph, and I said, the Berlioz Requiem, we were talking about reference recordings years ago, decades ago. And I said, of course, it's Charles Munch. And he said, oh, absolutely, it's Charles Munch. But he was thinking about the DG recording, which he knew extremely well, and he and his colleagues had been promoting. And I knew this one. And I said to him, well, you got to hear this one. It's a lot better than that one. I had that one. I had it on LP because I was curious about the differences between the two. Munch is on better form in 1960, and not because he was necessarily near death in 68. I think it has to do, quite frankly, with the familiarity of the orchestra with the idiom and with the work, and what he was able to accomplish. Also, the sonics are much better on RCA. My goodness, the living stereo recording, although the German radio engineers are very good. But all of those Bavarian radio mega productions from those days, including Kubelik doing things like Mahler 8 and Gurlieder, they sound small scale. They're studio bound in some way. I mean, the recordings don't have that sort of amplitude and the bigness. And the orchestra didn't have the sound either. They didn't have the sonority, the big moments in the Dies Irae and the Lacrimosa, where you've got, the percussion going crazy and all the timpanists going. They don't register with anything close to the impact that you hear on the RCA recording. But it doesn't matter, because as I've said a million times, with these reference recordings, it's not necessarily the best recording. And what everybody knew was that Munch was your reference Berlioz guy, no matter what he did. Remember, he did the Symphony Fantastique 500 times, including one on Hungaraton in Budapest. And, it was Munch doing the Symphony Fantastique. Some of his performances were a lot less good than others. And this is the case here. So if you were in Europe, in the 1960s, your Berlioz Requiem reference, and afterwards, for quite a while, was the Munch DG Bavarian radio recording. It was the Boston Symphony recording, if you were over here, and maybe in certain other territories where that recording was available. But it was Munch no matter how you slice it. And once this came out and everybody had a chance to hear it, it was this one. The DG was issued as a budget French release with Herald in Italy, the Markevich Herald in Italy, and one of the Markevich Herald in Italy's, or whatever it was, and there was also it was also released on DG Originals, so you could get it either way. I have it in one of those Originals boxes over there somewhere, which I just can't be bothered to find. But you can make the comparisons yourself if you have both of them. But however you do it, as I said, the reference recording for Berlioz Requiem has got to be one conducted by Charles Munch. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.